Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Terminator Ty 17, and today we're going to be looking at America's most famous battleship, the USS Iowa, both in the game and in real life. Now, originally this was actually supposed to be a destroyer video. I was planning to do the Akatsuki, or an American destroyer like Kidd. But I have since recently learned that, as of about a week and a half ago, I learned that on Sunday, 2 days away, I'm going to be touring the USS New Jersey. And for those of you who don't know, New Jersey is one of the four Iowa-class battleships in Camden, New Jersey, which is right across the river from Philadelphia. So because of that, I thought that I'd do an Iowa video, actually an Iowa series really, so an Iowa video on the history of the Iowa, a video on the stats of the Iowa in game, and then a gameplay video, and then probably what I'll do is like my North Carolina video. I'll probably take a decent amount of recordings for you guys, so you can see what it was like for my tour of the ship. I know that was really popular on the channel. It's actually my most popular segments on my channel is the actual ship tours, kind of the quote-unquote specials of the channel. That's like kind of I like to think of them as. But anyway, this is the history video of the Iowa, and so let's get into it. So, USS Iowa was the lead ship of her class, and she was part of a growing arsenal of fast battleships that the United States was building at the time. And if you recall in the North Carolina video, the United States Navy needed and therefore started producing battleships to keep up with the fast carrier task forces, which carriers themselves are surprisingly fast, along with cruisers and destroyers, which are also keep up with those carriers and even faster than those carriers. So they needed fast battleships to keep up with these task groups and to escort these task groups, which is where Iowa came in. This wasn't the idea of the fast battleships was not a new concept when they were constructing the Iowas, but these four ships, including Iowa herself, were just the next ship in line to have this idea implemented upon. Iowa, and more specifically the Iowa class, were the latest and greatest battleships built for, basically, like I said, keeping up with the escort forces. The ship herself was laid down in June of 1940 at the New York Naval Yard and was launched on the 27th of August 1942. The commissioning ceremony was on the 22nd of February 1943, and shortly thereafter she was sent off to her shakedown trials in the Chesapeake Bay and up and down the Atlantic coast. Iowa had three other ships built after it, it's worth mentioning. So the New Jersey was put into service not long after the lead ship of the class in May of 1943. So Iowa and New Jersey actually, because of they came out so close to each other, roughly the same time period, give or take a couple months, they operated a lot together in the Pacific Theater, in the same task forces and the same task groups and the same battles and what have you. And then also the Wisconsin and Missouri, the other final two of the Iowas, were commissioned in April and June of 1944 respectively. So the combat career of Iowa, her first assignment was they actually brought her to the Atlantic after sea trials with the Navy stationing her in Newfoundland, and the ship was placed there due to a possibility of the German battleship Tirpitz breaking out into the Atlantic. Tirpitz, if you realize, Tirpitz is the sister ship of Bismarck. But the German battleship remained stationary in the Norwegian fjords, of where she was really kept hidden, and so there is no threat was posed, and Iowa headed back to Norfolk for 2 weeks of routine repairs. Not 2 years, that'd be a long repair period. So since she was regarded as the country's capital ship at the time, Iowa received the great honor of transporting President Roosevelt, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Chief of Staff Admiral William Leahy, Chief of Staff of the Army George Marshall, Chief of Naval Operations Ernest King, Commander of the Army Air Forces Hap Arnold, across the Atlantic to the port of Mers El Kabir in Algeria, and this was the first portion of the journey to the Tehran Conference, a meeting between the quote-unquote Big Three, which was Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, to discuss the opening a second front on Nazi Germany. So the cool thing about Iowa is that she's the only battleship that ever really transported and carried around a president. Even if it was just for a 1 or 2 week long journey, it wasn't for very long. With that being said, that's a unique part of her history that really no other battleship has. She was transferred to the Pacific after that to take on the Japanese in their theater of war, sailing through the Panama Canal on the 7th of February 1944. And through the final days of January, and the first days of February, the battleship escorted carriers as they launched their airstrikes at Kwajalein and Eniwetok as part of Task Group 58. Her next campaign focused on the atoll of Truk, or Truk, depending on how you say it. There's 2 ways to say it, really. I've heard, at least. In the Caroline Islands in support of the carrier air groups that conducted aerial and strafing bombardment of that island. The significance of this is that Truk served as a major Japanese naval and logistical base for resupplying, repairing ships, and was also the forward staging area / anchorage for all Japanese ships in the South Pacific at the time. So, in other words, it was like their Pearl Harbor, very important and a strategic location. Knocking out this heavily fortified installation would be crucial if the U.S. Navy wanted to move forward in the Pacific waters. And so Admiral Ray Spruance, who was the commander of the overall naval task force assaulting Truk Atoll, from his flagship, Iowa's sister USS New Jersey, he commanded that overall battle, and his carriers launched their airstrikes against the island and remained stationary while doing so. And meanwhile, Spruance personally led a detachment of ships around the atoll to catch any escaping Japanese ships, but it was discovered that the Japanese main battle fleet, all the big carriers and battleships, and supporting ships for that matter, had already fled the scene shortly before. Now only stragglers, or quote-unquote piecemeal, of the enemy navy remained, which were just a few destroyers, 1 light cruiser, and 1 armed trawler were all that remained. Spruance, with his force of Iowa, New Jersey, the cruisers New Orleans, which you may recognize from the game, and Minneapolis, and also an assortment of 4 destroyers, helped to take out the destroyer Meikaze, light cruiser Katori, and an armed merchant ship. This was the only surface-to-surface combat Iowa, as well as the Iowa class, would ever face during the Second World War, and for the rest of their careers for that matter. On the 18th of March, 1944, she helped bombard Mili Atoll, even taking 2 hits from a Japanese 4.7-inch or 120mm gun. But the damage was minimal to the battleship. She pretty much just shrugged it off. During June 13th and 14th, 1944, Iowa bombarded the Mariana Islands of Tinian and Saipan, also along with New Jersey in support for the amphibious landings there. Following on the 19th of June, Iowa was involved in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which was the biggest carrier battle ever. And naval historians will often kind of quote this as a huge turning point in the war, at least aircraft carrier-wise. So she was involved in that battle and helped repel 4 massive Japanese air attacks. And during this, she is credited with 4 planes added to her tally, her anti-aircraft gun battery, their tally for that. After a rest at Eniwetok, she sailed as part of Halsey's 3rd Fleet and was in support of the landings on Peleliu on September 17th. She found herself escorting carriers again. This time, airstrikes were directed at the Philippines, and Iowa fought off the first of the infamous kamikaze attacks. Now, if you don't know, kamikaze attacks are basically Japanese suicide planes. The whole Japanese society at that time revolved around the concept of honor. So if you did not die in a quote-unquote honorable way, then you were considered a disgrace to your country, your family, and also yourself. And it's basically a way of letting everybody down. So rather than knowing when they're beat and surrendering, the most honorable thing to do would be to fill their plane up with as much gasoline and as many bombs as they could carry, and aim for the biggest ships, which were usually battleships and carriers in American task groups, and they would just ram their planes straight into the enemy, into American ships, hoping to cause superficial or even critical damage. And it was very successful because the American ships found out that not only did they have to shoot the plane down, but they would have to completely destroy the plane in order to prevent it from actually coming in and ramming the ship. Because a plane can still miss a wing while ramming into a ship. So they had to completely shred the plane apart in order to stop the kamikaze attacks. And the Americans were caught very, very off guard by this. They did not expect it at all. So that just goes to show you the two completely different types of enemy there were. She also participated in the Battle of the Leyte Gulf, but did not see much action as Iowa's force was chasing the decoy Japanese fleet of the battle. And this was actually the only possible time that Iowa and Yamato ever came close to being in contact of one another. I know a lot of people in this video game fan base often talk about what it would be like if Iowa and Yamato saw themselves in combat and who would win. And it's really, my take on that is that it's really what the conditions of the battle are and what kind of the context is. So yeah, that's all I'm going to say. I don't really have a clear winner in mind. On December 18th, the Third Fleet was in the process of refueling itself. A storm with a hurricane-level intensity, codenamed Typhoon Cobra, swept its way over the fleet. 3 destroyers were lost, along with 5 aircraft carriers, 3 other destroyers, and a cruiser suffering severe damage. Even the large, sturdy battleships like North Carolina, New Jersey, and Iowa herself struggled to find their balance during the storm. Thankfully, none of the crew of the ship was killed or wounded, but the Typhoon did manage to knock out one of the propeller shafts, and so she sailed back to America for repairs and made it into San Francisco on the 15th of January, 1945. In the final months of the war, she would help escort carriers and bombard steel mills on the coast of mainland Japan. On August the 29th, 1945, she, alongside with her sister ship Missouri, which is also in the game, sailed into Tokyo Bay. Iowa was right alongside her famed sister ship as the peace treaty between the Japanese and Allied governments was signed on Missouri's decks. The reason that the treaty was signed on Missouri, a relatively newer ship that hadn't really seen that much combat, versus the battle-seasoned Iowa, was because the president at the time, Harry Truman, was actually from the state of Missouri, so that's why he picked it for the signing. And Iowa helped bring back POWs and GIs back stateside, and the battleship was decommissioned on March 24th, 1949. Now, that's usually where most of these ships in the game, that's where their career ends. They see World War II, and then after that they are scrapped, never to be really commissioned or put into service again. And you think that's where the Iowa's career ended. However, in 1950, the communist North Korea invaded its southern counterpart, the United Nations, and the UN responded by sending troops to the south, South Korea's aid, as well as a significant air and naval force there as well. So on July 14th, 1951, Iowa, along with their 3 sisters, were reactivated back into service to do what they had done pretty much in the previous war, which was shell enemy positions off the coast. In April of 1942, the battleship arrived off the Korean coast, relieving her sister, the Wisconsin. Over the course of the next year, Iowa would shell vital enemy supply lines, railroad tracks, supply depots, and industrial centers. After the war, she served in the Mediterranean and on the Atlantic coast of the U.S. until she was decommissioned from service again in February of 1958. 24 years rolled by, and it was by now well into the 1980s. All 4 Iowas they're basically put in the mothball fleet, or at least USS Iowa herself is put in the mothball fleet, basically gathering dust and not being operated. Until President Ronald Reagan came into office at the time, and one of his policies was dramatically increasing military spending as part of his agenda to quote-unquote outspend the Soviet Union. And so as a result, the Navy expanded, and therefore all 4 Iowas were reactivated, and Iowa herself was reactivated in '82. The dockyard workers took off all of those old 20mm and 40mm AA guns that had served their purpose well in World War II, but were now, with the new laser-guided and radar-guided technology, proved to be super obsolete. The ship traveled to multiple friendly Central American and South American countries to show the U.S.'s support and military power, and she also participated in NATO exercises during this time. It should be noted that while Iowa was enjoying this career, her sisters, both Missouri and Wisconsin, were activated for the Gulf War, also known as Operation Desert Storm, and the battleships shelled Iraqi positions such as communication outposts or bunkers in the Persian Gulf. On the contrary, a little bit earlier, the USS New Jersey was the only battleship to serve in Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, shelling North Vietnamese bridges and railways off the coast. On April 19, 1989, the greatest tragedy that ever occurred on Iowa took place. During a training exercise, a sudden explosion rocked turret number 2. 47 sailors were tragically killed. No one expected these losses to come from the ship during a time when there wasn't an active war. In the mid-1990s, Iowa and her sisters were decommissioned for the final time. However, when the National Defense Authorization Act of 1996 was passed, it required the Navy to preserve and maintain at least 2 Iowa-class battleships in case, for whatever reason, for whatever emergency, they needed to be called back into service. Ultimately, at the end of the day, both Iowa and Wisconsin were chosen as the ships to maintain. Starting in December of 2011, Iowa was finally opened for tours as a museum ship to the public in San Pedro, California, which is a suburb town of Los Angeles. All 4 Iowa-class battleships still exist and are on display as museums today, and due to that Defense Act, where the Navy requires 2 ships to be activated again, and the fact that the Iowa served up until so recently, leaves all 4 ships incredibly preserved. So there you go, that's the history of the USS Iowa. The final thing I'll say before we get to the statistics and gameplay is that these museum ships are out there. I highly recommend visiting them, especially all 4 Iowas are still, you can come aboard all of them. All 4 are preserved as museums today, as I said. The Iowa herself is in San Pedro, like I said. The New Jersey is in Camden, New Jersey, which is right across the river, parked in the Delaware River, across from Philadelphia. The Wisconsin is in Norfolk, Virginia, as a museum ship. And then the Missouri is in Pearl Harbor, right next to the USS Arizona Memorial, which is very symbolic in a way because the Arizona represents the start of World War II for us, and the Missouri represents the end since the treaty was signed on her decks. So yeah, I'd highly recommend visiting the ships in real life. They are just astounding to look at in pretty much every way. One thing I think that this game doesn't do a good job at is just showing the pure scale of what these warships, how actually big they are. So if you've never been on a battleship and you've played this game, just go ahead and tour one. It'll probably blow your mind, considering that you are used to seeing a battleship that the length of your screen. So anyway, I highly recommend visiting the museum ships wherever you can find them, both battleships and carriers, and even the couple destroyers that are out there. I'm very excited to go on to New Jersey in a couple days, so I'll make sure to get that special for anyone who's interested. I'll make sure to get that video out along with this series. And with that, let's move to the stats.